Hello and welcome to RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences. My name is Dr. Mary Collins and I'm delighted to chair this session, the first of the MyHealth Positive Health mini-series of 2021. This series brings together leading healthcare experts in the field of health and well-being. And the objective of the sessions are to empower people to make informed decisions around their health and well-being. In adherence with public health guidelines, we are recording this session remotely, so it might look a little different to other sessions you will have seen in the MyHealth series. Our first session is focused on the science of happiness, and this session is hosted by the RCSI Centre for Positive Psychology and Health. Today, I'm joined by Professor Kieran O'Boyle, Director at RCSI Centre for Positive Psychology and Health, Dr. Trudy Meehan, who's a lecturer at the Centre, and Dr. Porrick Dunn, immunologist, practicing psychotherapist, and meditation teacher at the Centre of Positive Psychology and Health. So to open our session today, Professor Kieran O'Boyle will give a short presentation to introduce today's topic on the science of happiness.
Thanks very much, Mary, and great to be here. So this evening we're going to talk about the science of happiness, and I want to look at a number of dimensions of happiness. We're going to look at what science says happiness is. We're going to ask the question, can we measure happiness? What influences our happiness? And then, most importantly, how does science say that we can increase our level of happiness? So let's start with the question, what is happiness? And happiness is a complex term. The best model that we know of is called the PERMA model. And it was described by Martin Seligman, who's a psychologist. We consider the father of positive psychology. And what Seligman suggests that when you're thinking about your levels of happiness, there are really 5 things that you've got to think about. The first is, how much positive emotion do you experience? How often do you experience positive emotions? We're talking here about emotions such as happiness, joy, excitement, contentment, and so on. So that's the sort of feeling level. The second level is engagement. And the idea here is that we need to feel fulfillment by engaging in activities, could be music, work, sports, hobbies, and so on, which we find interesting and absorbing. And that helps us to achieve a sense of what Seligman calls flow. And you'll know when you're in a state of flow because time feels like it stops and you become unaware of what's going on around you and you become completely absorbed in what you're doing. The R stands for relationships, incredibly important in terms of our happiness. We thrive off our relationships with others. And if we nurture strong and healthy relationships, that provides us with experiences of attachment, of support. We feel valued, we feel loved. So that's the R of PERMA. The M then stands for meaning. So it is important for our happiness that we have a sense of meaning and purpose in our daily lives. That's in fact crucial. So that might involve pursuing goals, serving something bigger than ourselves. And this in fact has a history that goes back to Aristotle. It's sometimes called eudaimonia. It's the idea that our lives need to be meaningful for us to feel happy. And then finally, we all need a sense of accomplishment. It's very important for our happiness that we feel a sense of mastery, that we feel that we're achieving things, that we're making things happen. So the PERMA model is a very useful way of thinking about your happiness overall and seeing where you're doing well and perhaps where you might have to do a little bit of work to increase your level of happiness. So that brings us to the question, can we measure happiness? And we've seen emerging over the last 20 to 30 years now, a new science called the science of positive psychology. And this is really the science of happiness and well-being. The key idea here is that we use the scientific method to look at happiness. And whereas psychology for many, many years was really largely concerned with stress and depression, anxiety, and so on, the downside, if you like, of the human condition, positive psychology is very much concerned with the upside of the human condition. If you think about it in terms of clinical psychology, getting us from -8 to -2, improving our mental health, we can think of positive psychology as getting us from +2 to +8. It's really about joy and happiness and so on. So the scientific study of optimal human functioning is what positive psychology is. And what we're interested in here is trying to discover the factors that allow individuals and communities, indeed, organizations, workplaces, uh, local communities, to thrive, to really do well. So what I'd like you to do now is take a little moment. This is the Diener's satisfaction with life scale. And you can see it runs from a scale of 1 on the left there to 7 on the right. And what I'd like you to do is just take a moment pretty quickly to rate yourself on each of these 5 questions. So in most ways, my life is close to my ideal. What score would you give that now? Would you agree with that? Slightly disagree? Neither agree nor disagree. Just give it a little score. The conditions of my life are excellent. How would you score that? I'm satisfied with my life. Again, score on a scale from 1 to 7. So far, I have got the important things I want in life. And if I could have my life over, I would change almost nothing. Sorry for the typo there. So if you just add up your scores will range between 5 and 35. And this scale has been used with hundreds of thousands of people. And here are the kinds of norms that you can compare yourself against. A score of between 5 and 14, less than 14, is less than average in general. The average range is 15 to 25. And if you're scoring between 26 and 35, that means you're rating yourself as quite happy with your life as a whole. So just a quick way of measuring your level of happiness. So let's look now at what influences our happiness. And there's a great deal of research on this. I'm showing you there the webpage for the World Happiness Report, which is a very large, detailed study of happiness in 150 countries. It's done every year. And one of the really interesting things about this is that if you look at happiness in general, people score on an average of 6.75 on a 1 to 10 scale. So in other words, we score ourselves as being on the happier side of things on average. If we ask the question, where does Ireland as a country sit on this scale? Well, I'm showing you there our ranking for the most recent figures, which are from were published in 2020, cover the years 2017 to 2019, and we rank 16 out of 156 countries. And that rating you can see in the little box there is based on GDP, healthy life expectancy, having good support, feeling that we have the freedom to make choices in our lives, generosity of people, perceptions of corruption, negatively weighted, and then the balance of positive feelings. So as a country, we score high on the happiness stakes. Now, this is a very important idea, the idea that while some of our happiness is determined by our genetics, by our parents, by our personality, but 50% we reckon is determined by that. About 10% is determined by our circumstances, but about 40% is determined by our internal psychological state. And the beauty about that is that we have a fair degree of control over that 40%. We can do a lot, even if we can't control our genetics and we can't control our circumstances, we can still do quite a lot to improve our sense of happiness and well-being. So, huge amount of research available on this. We know that personality is important to happiness. We know that these kinds of circumstances, where we live, our physical environment, our culture, religion, wealth up to a point, marriage, married people are usually happier, support, education, work, recreation, age, health, and so on. These are all circumstances that contribute to our overall level of happiness. So what we want to do is think a little bit about that 40%, the kinds of things that we can do to increase our happiness, because clearly we can't change our genetics and we may have little or no control over our circumstances. Well, these are the things that science has demonstrated through vast amount of research that we can use to increase our happiness. Building relationships, extremely important. Setting goals that we value. Very important, identifying and using our personal strengths. A lot of us are very aware of our weaknesses. It's well worth thinking and working out what our strengths are and using those. Taking time to savor and enjoy pleasurable things. Finding flow, that's that sense of absorption we were talking about. Being grateful, gratitude is extremely important for happiness, showing gratitude. Developing an optimistic way of thinking. And then strengthening our relationships if we're in a couple relationship, or strengthening parent-child relationships. And also practicing forgiveness. And the list goes on. Regular physical exercise, mindful meditation, learning progressive muscle relaxation, learning to solve problems, being courageous, particularly when we're dealing with anxiety, using assertiveness to manage our anger, developing our resilience, and then learning to live with trauma if we've had traumatic experiences. So all of these are examples of things that we can do to improve our own happiness and to help others improve theirs. I'm just going to focus in briefly before we finish on one exercise that's been shown to be particularly effective. And the idea here is that you count your blessings essentially every day. If you begin to keep a daily journal in which you write down, best to do this before going to sleep, 3 things that went well today, and just reflect on why they went well. If you do this for weeks, best to do it on an ongoing basis because it does make a real difference to your sense of happiness. It's more subtle than it appears because what it is doing is it is sensitizing us to the positive things that are happening during our day. We know from a lot of research that we're hardwired to be much more aware of the negative things that happen in our environment. This is a way of starting to orientate towards the positive things that are also happening. It also means if we're thinking about why they happened, we're thinking more about what we can do to make them happen more often. And it does seem that going to sleep in this positive frame of mind actually improves our sleep. So a lot of research has been done with this to show that this is a quick way of increasing our general sense of happiness and well-being. Works very well with children and young people also. So there's an example of a very specific technique that you can use over time to increase your sense of happiness. In conclusion, then, I just want to briefly mention a new program for the public that we'll be launching in February of this year. It's called the Science of Health and Happiness. We'll be running this from the Centre for Positive Psychology and Health here in the RCSI. And you can see there we'll be dealing with mind-body connections in health and disease, whole person health. We'll deal in more detail with the roots to happiness. We'll talk about meditation. We'll talk about your emotional health, your strongest self, and then happiness throughout the life cycle. So if you're interested in that program, just link onto the web link that's given there and register for the course. Finally, it's worth reflecting on what the Dalai Lama has to say about happiness. He says, happiness is not something ready made, it comes from your own actions. And I think we've seen on some of the slides from that research, our own actions can serve to significantly increase our sense of happiness.
Thank you, Kieran, for that most insightful presentation. I'd just like to come back to your final quote from the Dalai Lama, um, where he says that happiness is not ready made, it comes from our own actions. Could you say a little bit more about that, Kieran, and what exactly do you mean by actions?
Well, one of the, I think, important actions is really to do with managing our thinking. We're not our thoughts. And we in psychology talk a lot about mindsets, and my colleagues, Padraig and Trudy, are going to say quite a bit about this. But essentially, a mindset is a way of thinking about things. And if we choose a growth mindset, and that's an action, we're thinking about things in a different frame of mind. So, for example, we're learning from experiences, even from mistakes or negative experiences. If we have a fixed mindset, we tend to go about things as if the world is fixed and there's nothing much I can do about it. So, learning to change the way we engage with the world, the way we think about things, would be an example, Mary, of an action that we can take which can significantly improve our happiness. And of course, there are all kinds of other actions like physical activity, meditation, and so on. The key point, I think, is we have more control than perhaps we often think we have. There's more we can do than perhaps we think we can.
Yes, great. Thank you, Kieran. And you certainly shared many ways with us in your presentation as to how we can enhance our own happiness. And it's great that they're all evidence based ways as well. So, just if I open it up to the panel now, I know we're very fortunate to be joined by very accomplished experts in this field of health and well-being. And I'm sure people would be interested to hear what each of you do to enhance your own happiness. So, can I go to Porrick first, please? Porrick, could you share with us what you do to enhance your own personal happiness?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. It's good to be part of this webinar. I think it's a very exciting topic. For me, I do two things on a daily basis, and I think the recent pandemic has actually helped me develop that into more of a habit, and it's given me more space and time to engage it. And that is to walk daily. So I'm fortunate enough to live in the middle of nowhere in South Kildare. So I've got a very nice little forested bog near me. I'm very fortunate. And I actually go down there twice a day to walk. And I don't walk alone, I walk with my dogs. And for me, to bring animals into this aspect of happiness is really important. So obviously other human beings are very important too, but I think if you can bring animals into the picture, especially animals like dogs that you can bring out, they're always looking longingly at you, begging you for a walk.
Mhm.
So even if you don't feel like going out in the rain, they're certainly going to drag you out into the rain. And for me, that gives me time to focus, to breathe, to relax, but it also gives me aspect to the good things that are external to me, like physical exercise, being in nature, and just being separate from the hustle and bustle as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Porrick. And I think, nature is a wonderful way, and we're really seeing the benefits of that now. Particularly those of us who are working from home and perhaps have more time to get out and about in nature. So, Kieran, can I go to you, please? What can you share with us what you do to enhance your happiness?
Thanks, Mary. Well, I think this is a very challenging time for everybody. Two things really are important to me. The first is this idea, it goes back to the Stoic philosophers, that lots of things are out of our control. So I try to focus on the things that I can actually control. And then I don't worry so much about the things that I can't control. Making that distinction for me is really very helpful. And then, like Padraig, getting out in nature every day is extremely important for me. I'm very lucky again where I live. I'm close to the sea, and anybody who goes and looks at the sea, I think, feels a bit happier.
Yeah, yeah, great. Thanks, Kieran. And over to you, Trudy. Can you share with us, please, what works for you?
Thanks, Mary. I think what works for me is radically different than what used to work for me. And that was a huge challenge. And I think lockdown one was when I learned to do it and to do a new way of being happy, essentially. And I was dragged kicking and screaming back into domestic life, or I guess into domestic life for the first time fully. I would have considered myself almost a workaholic, and being a working mom, but constantly busy and moving, and always juggling. And there was times during lockdown one where I had to slow down, be present. There was nowhere to go. I had nothing to prepare. There was nowhere I could get into the car and be. I was in the house, and I really needed to learn to be present. And then something shifted and I realized I could do it and I could actually enjoy being present, and I got to enjoy my little girl in a whole new way. And really, I guess, settling into that and accepting that there was a new meaning in my life, and making space for that. So I think for me, what makes me happy now is making space and allowing new things to emerge, and smaller things that aren't shiny, or busy. They're quite humble things. And so to make space for those and to appreciate those has really helped me a lot. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for that, Trudy. And if I can just stay with you, Trudy, I know you, like many of us, myself included, we're homeschooling at the moment and trying to balance work. But it is particularly challenging for children and young people. It's a very, very difficult time for them. And I know this is an area you will be speaking to us in the third of this My Health series. But can you share with us, for parents and caregivers out there, what are some practical things they can do to support the happiness of children and young people at this time?
Thanks, Mary. That's a really great question. And I know a lot of parents and caregivers must be really very stressed at the moment. And I think there's two phrases: the school of life, and then you can rephrase that and make it very fancy and call it experiential learning. And the big thing about experiential learning, or the school of life, is that it's usually valuable. It has become undervalued, and research has shown that it's become diminished in our children's lives. A study from the University of Virginia looked back at kindergarten. It was a US study, but they looked back to 1998 versus more contemporary teaching practices. And they found that children are engaged in way more passive learning than they used to be. And I think we've seen that in Ireland as well over time. So our children over time have had that experiential learning opportunities taken away from them. And this situation, as challenging as it is, has given rise to this space where they have to kind of play, they have to occupy themselves, they have to make a plan, and they have to direct their own activity a lot of the time. They don't have somebody who knows what they're doing moment by moment of the day. They're busy kind of building something or making a sandwich or getting a stool and looking for something in the cupboard. They're exploring the house and testing their agency in ways that they didn't. And that's a good thing. And I think as parents and caregivers, we need to be okay with that and understand that it's about the process, and it's about playing and doing and being. And also it's about not doing, because allowing space for boredom and reflection is really important for a child's social and emotional development. We need to be able to reflect on our inner world. And this is a unique opportunity. During the first lockdown, Spun Out and the Department of Child and Youth Affairs conducted a survey asking young people about their challenges, but they also asked them about positives. And one of the positives that young people mentioned was having more quality time at home with family and more time to work on self-care. So especially for our teenagers and older children, to be able to have that reflection space and that quiet time, they might say they're really bored, they might feel very stressed and challenged by it, but it is actually very valuable to have that time. So I think those are things I wanted to say. And the last thing I want to say for parents and caregivers is about looking after yourself and guilt. I think I spent most of the day trying to tell myself, don't feel guilty, don't feel guilty. And then I remembered it's impossible. You can't push it away. And the more you say don't feel guilty, the more it pops up. So whatever you're feeling, because I think a lot of us are feeling some level of stress, whether it's guilt or anger or frustration, don't try and push it away. Be curious. Have a conversation with it. What's this guilt about? Is it telling me that I absolutely hate being at home and I never want to do this again? And so it's giving you information about your work. Is it telling you that you love being at home and you want to do this forever? And it's giving you information about changing direction and being more at home. Just be curious. And the last thing, be compassionate. Whatever answer comes from that curiosity, just park it. Just let it hang there. Just let it exist. You can come back to it when the crisis is over. You've learned something new. It's interesting. Be gentle with it. Be compassionate, and come back around to it when there's an opportunity to explore it further.
I think really important advice there. And it's very key that parents and caregivers look after themselves first, as you say. And I think the power of reflection and taking time out. And I really like that, the school of life, and that takes the pressure off us as well, with all the lists of activities to get done every day. Um, so thanks for that, Trudy. If I can go to you now, Porrick, and if we can talk a little about the link between physical health and happiness. Can you share some thoughts on that, please?
Really, it's down to the fault of modern medicine and science over the last few hundred years, really, that we've kind of temporarily isolated the head and the mind from the body. So we've segregated the two as if they're two very different systems. And of course, the reality is we're not one giant head walking around. We're actually an integrated system where the head, the mind, and the body are all one unit. And I think we forget that sometimes in terms of, medical specialities focus on different aspects of the body and the mind and the brain. But the reality is, as I said, it's all connected. So for me, in terms of happiness, it's really all about an inside out and an outside in approach. So coming from the mental perspective and the impact of that on the body and your external reality, but also the external reality and what you do physically in that reality and that impact on your mind. So it's a body impact on mind and a mind impact on body. And one of the most positive and optimistic things that I've certainly learned through positive psychology, and Kieran has mentioned it in his presentation there, was that, okay, your genetics might not be within your control. You're born with what you're born with. Now, the field of epigenetics might have something to say about that, but largely speaking, we have the genes we have. But the really exciting and positive thing about that slide that Kieran showed was that 40% or approximately 40% is within our control. And that comes from our mental perspective on reality. So not just the mental perspective on the external reality, but our mental perspective on the internal reality. And what most of us don't realize, and I certainly spent a lot of my life not realizing that, number one, I am not my thoughts. So I don't necessarily have to believe my thoughts, number one. But number two, perspective is everything. So if I believe a certain thing about reality, I tend to conjure up that reality inside me and outside of me. So if I have a negative perspective on myself or on the external world, well, then I'll start having negative impacts on my physical body. So this is an absolute fact. So there's a huge amount of empirical data out there from hundreds and hundreds of research papers looking at the impact of mental perspective on the body itself. So for example, if you have profound negative thinking about yourself on a consistent basis, but even just once, so one thought can initiate a stress cascade in your brain that leads to the production of stress hormones. Those stress hormones then flood into your bloodstream. They have an impact on your gut. They have an impact on the good bacteria that live in your gut. They have an impact on your immune system. They, over a long period of time, actually they lead to a dysfunctional immune system. They have an impact on your metabolism, so how your body generates energy. And they have an impact on your nervous system. So the fact that a thought and your perspective on your reality can have a direct and immediate impact on your body, I think is kind of scary in one sense, but also powerful in another, because that means that if you can get some kind of control on your perspective, and there are many techniques, and Kieran talked about a lot of them there in his slides, that if you can get a handle on those techniques, well, then you can start creating a less distorted perception about yourself and about the external world. And I think that's really important now, especially during a pandemic. So that's kind of the inside out approach and how the mind impacts on the body in terms of happiness. But happiness is also outside as well. And, you know, for me, the phrase happiness is also in a bowl of porridge, or happiness is in a run, or happiness, as I mentioned earlier, is in walking your dog. So there are so many things that we can do that are external that also contribute to our happiness. And I mean, at the Centre, we're very heavily involved in this in lifestyle medicine, and the importance of a healthy diet, the importance of exercise, not going crazy and spending 2 hours in the gym, but just natural movement, and the importance of sleep, as Kieran mentioned, the importance of relationships, substance control. And all of these issues that are the outside-in approach to happiness have never been more important than they are right now during this pandemic. So I think if we can focus on, number one, then perspective is everything. If we can take some control of the perspective, understand that perspective can be dangerous, that it has an impact on our body, but also happiness is not just about perspective, it's also about the things that we can do that are outside to help increase our happiness.
That's great. Thanks, Porrick. I think fascinating research there on the mind-body connection. And that framework, it's very helpful, the outside in, inside out approach. So thank you for sharing that. So Kieran, if I can go back to you, could you say a little more around the power of relationships and the links to happiness, please?
Yeah, yes, indeed. We know from some really interesting research that disconnection, isolation is really, really bad for us. Human beings don't do well with isolation. And early studies done in these research centers in the Arctic and the Antarctic and so on, people trying to live in caves for months, we do very badly. We are made for connection. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have at the moment is connection is very difficult, because we're being asked, all of us, to isolate for the common good, you know. And I think that a lot of us find that really, really difficult, because the normal thing is to interact with others, you know, friends, colleagues, social, and I think it's particularly difficult for young people, as Trudy was saying. So I think it's extremely important to try to maintain relationships in as much as we possibly can. One of the big losses, I think, in terms of working from home is the loss of that ordinary kind of social interaction that we get at work, because we don't just work for wages or for a salary. We work for all kinds of reasons, one of the most important of which is a sense of belonging. You know, Maslow, we go right back into early psychology of this, and Maslow would say that belonging is extremely important to us as human beings. So I think a number of things follow from that. The first is that we have to work proactively to maintain our relationships. And clearly technology is one of the ways of doing that. But I think we do have to work at it. I think it's very easy for it to slip. I have to watch it myself, you know, with my family, that I try to keep the contacts and make the effort there. I think for those of us living in houses, living with family and living within the small, our own immediate family circle, I think that has challenges in the current system as well. It's great, people get to spend a lot more time together, but they have to be able to manage distancing when that's not working out, because sometimes people need their own space as well. And while I think it's wonderful, you see lots of families, you know, out walking together, exercising together, that's marvelous. I think that has to be balanced with time for oneself. Mm-hmm. And then the final thing I would say about that, it really comes back to something Trudy was saying, I think is very, very important, is this idea of compassion. You know, the one thing about this pandemic right now is everybody is finding it difficult. Worldwide, we're all finding it a challenge. So I think we have to adopt a compassionate approach to others. And here in the RCSI, we have kindness as one of our key values in RCSI. So I think being compassionate and being kind to others, because most people are finding this very stressful. And then it follows on from that, being compassionate with oneself, because if we talk about relationships, your relationship with yourself is an extremely important part of that. And then, as Porrick says, that's all linked together, because we have a lot of research to show that compassionate behavior it benefits both the person receiving the behavior, the person that we're being compassionate to, but it also hugely benefits ourselves, both in terms not only of our psychological health, but also in terms of our physical health and well-being.
And we taught, you mentioned there about particularly young people and the need to, for the social supports and the relationships and the networks around them. And Trudy, if I may come back to you again on this, the link between relationships and happiness through the lens of children and younger people, have you any practical strategies that you could share with us around that?
Thanks very much, Mary. Yes, it's really important, and especially for teenagers and adolescents, because developmentally they're at a point in their lives where they need that social referencing, and they want to hear from their peers to whether they're measuring up or whether they're fitting in. So it's really challenging for them. I think for teenagers especially, because they need a certain amount of agency and they need to develop their identity, and they need to do that in private. Essentially, they do that usually outside of the house with their peers. It's important for caregivers and parents to make space for teenagers and young people, young adults, to have privacy in the house where they can have a Zoom call with their friends and be loud and be silly and, be themselves in a way that they wouldn't be when the adults are listening in. And it's not great, but it's the best we can do. And sometimes, then the adults get out, get some space, get some air, take the dog for a walk, as Pádraig was saying. But I think it's important for all of us to have some space within the house and privacy, but for teenagers especially, because they're experimenting with their identity. And sometimes they're trying on an identity that they're not ready to reveal to their parent or caregiver. And they just want to play around with that with their friends, and they want to experiment with that, and they need that privacy to be able to do that. So whatever way we can to give them that space through a virtual connection with their friends and some privacy is really helpful, I think, for young people. For younger children, the one thing I would say, and it's really basic, but it's really helpful, and I'm saying this as a parent of a 5-year-old, fill up their emotional piggy bank with moments of focused connection and attention. They need very little. Like, if you give that focused attention, then you can have some time and they're happy to be distant and playing around the house and doing their own thing. But they need that emotional piggy bank. They need to feel seen, connected to you, and acknowledged. And then usually they're pretty happy to potter around and engage in their imaginative play and do things. But if you don't fill up the emotional piggy bank, your day and their day will be hell. So for younger kids, they need that connection with you. And the last thing to say for everybody living with each other at the moment, I think Kieran mentioned that bad is stronger than good. So negative interactions in a household can become very toxic very quickly. And what happens, research has shown, the Gottman Institute looks at couples relationships, but they've looked at people and they've shown that during the day, people make bids to each other. And a bid is basically a small action where you're looking to somebody else for a positive connection. And it might be, did you hear that about such and such thing in the newspaper? It might be a teenager screaming at you from the top of the stairs, asking you where the controller for the Xbox is. It might be a younger child, asking you to play with them. Respond to bids. Try to notice them in your house. Try to respond positively. And, you oftentimes can't give all the attention, but you might say, hey, I hear you're asking to play with me. I'd love to do that, but I'm busy working. Let's make a plan to connect later on in the day. So it's watch out for the bids. Try to respond positively to them, even for just 10, 20 seconds. Because if you don't notice those bids, people get very disheartened and feel disconnected and isolated very easily. So that would be the big thing with children and young people and the adults in your house as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Trudy. I think really insightful advice there. So in wrapping up our discussion, we've covered lots of ground on the signs of happiness. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to share with us one key take-home message. If you were to pick one message to share with our audience, So I'm going to go to Porrick first, please. What is your key take-home message, Porrick?
Thanks again, Mary. My take-home message would be to let go and let happen. So accept that which is within your control and let go of everything that's beyond your control. And let's face it, right now, decisions a government will make about lockdowns, decisions schools make about whether kids can or can't go to school, these things are enormous decisions that are beyond us as individuals at the moment. It doesn't mean that we tolerate any old guff, but at the same time, it means that we need to look at the things that are within our control and look at the things that are beyond, and really try and live in that central space where we manage the things that are within our control and do our best on a daily basis to let go of those other larger things, or they might be even smaller things within ourselves that we just have to let go of, you know. And the very last thing I'll say that's connected to that, and again, just to hammer home this message, because I know Kieran and Trudy have also mentioned this, is compassion. Be kind and compassionate to yourself first, and then to everybody around you. Try and develop an understanding, because this is difficult for all of us during this very crazy and unpredictable time.
Thanks, Porrick. Kieran, can I turn to you, please? Your key take-home message.
The key take-home message for me really is the PERMA idea. I think that's a very powerful way of thinking about your own happiness. And it's not just for COVID times. So if you think about your positive emotions, your engagement, your relationships, how you find meaning, and how you develop a sense of accomplishment. And one of the things that follows from that that's very important, you don't have to be experiencing positive emotions all the time to be happy. In fact, I know some grumpy people who are quite happy because they have a sense of meaning and a sense of accomplishment and a sense of engagement. So I think that provides a very good framework against which to look to see how your life is. And maybe there are things you can do there under those areas that you mightn't have thought about as being contributing to your happiness, that do in fact contribute to happiness.
I think that's a really helpful framework. And again, lots of evidence supporting it as well. So over to you, Trudy. What would your key take-home message be?
Thanks, Mary. I think this is probably a strange message, but if your children and young people are moving around, if they're causing a lot of chaos, if they're fighting, if they're, climbing on things that they don't normally climb on, if things in the house are upside down, that means they're working their cerebellum, and that means they're improving their literacy skills, and they're improving their thinking, and their learning will be even better when they get back to school. And I think it's really important because it's foundational, and the part of our brain that's involved in movement is really important for learning, for sequencing, for doing thinking what comes next in what sequence and when. If anybody's ever seen a young person doing mental arithmetic, you can almost see them moving the figures around in their brain. So for us to be good at any mental activity, we need to be able to move well, and the two are integrated. And it's back to Porrick's connection between the mind and body. So while your kids are moving, they're still learning, and it's okay.
Wonderful. So I think great take-home messages there. I'm certainly going to remember the let go, control the controllables within your life. Kieran talked about the PERMA model. That's really worth reading further into. And I love that concept, Trudy, of movement and letting our children move and play and have that freedom and space. So that concludes our discussion on the science of happiness. I'd like to sincerely thank our speakers, Professor Kieran O'Boyle, Dr. Porrick Dunn, and Dr. Trudy Meehan. Thanks to everyone for joining us for this session. And I'd just like to flag some dates for your diary. Our second in this MyHealth Positive Health mini series, our second session will air on February 1st. And the title of that one is Managing Coronaphobia, Stay Present. The final session will take place on February 23rd, and that is Future Proofing Our Youth. I think that will be a really, really interesting session. And just before we close, a final reminder on that excellent online program that Professor O'Boyle mentioned, The Science of Health and Happiness, and that will be starting in February. Full details will be available on the website. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event in the MyHealth Positive Health series on February 1st.